So I think the caption should be on. If anyone needs captions, you should be able to press the button at the bottom of the screen to enable captions. We are going to start now. I'm just gonna get rolling. So thank you so much for being here today. My name is Megan Linton, and I'm the policy lead with the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. We are here in support of Michal, and I'm so glad that you'll get to meet him today. I'm calling from Ottawa, the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And the Disability Justice Network is based in Hamilton, the city with the largest disability population in Canada. And Hamilton is situated on the Dish with One Spoon treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and people, Europeans and newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, disabled Indigenous peoples across Canada are forcibly removed from their communities and forced into nursing homes far from their families, communities, and cultures. We at the Disability Justice Network are in solidarity with the calls to action for increased access to healthcare on reserve and in rural areas that would challenge the colonial systems of institutionalization. The Disability Justice Network of Ontario is an organization that aims to build a just and accessible Ontario, wherein people with disabilities have personal and political agency, can thrive and foster in community, and can build the power, capacity, and skills needed to hold people, communities, institutions responsible for the spaces that we create. And we're here today with morbid urgency on behalf and in support of Michal Kaliszan and his urgent need for additional attendant services. I met Michal about 5 or 6 months ago and immediately knew that Michal was a compassionate, resilient, and determined member of our community, and that I would do anything to fight like hell to make sure that he remains in it. Without access to additional support in the community, Michal will die, and we support Michal's right to live in community. We support Michal's inherent right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and his right to be free from discrimination, as provided and outlined in Sections 7 and 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and outlined in Article 19 of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We at DJNO believe that people deserve to live in community and receive the care they need to survive. The current inability to create systems of care is a failure of our systems and the support we claim to provide. Michal's situation is one of many that demonstrates that depriving someone of the care they require to live in community can be deadly. Our communities are better when disabled people are in them, and I'm so grateful that Michal is in ours, and I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone that's attending. I really appreciate your time. I'm a private person, but it's very important to me that you know my story. It's not easy to open up to strangers, yet it's the only way I know how to avoid becoming a nameless statistic. Please do me the courtesy of patiently listening with compassion. Let me take you back to March 17th, 2002. While most people were celebrating St. Patrick's Day, I was with my mother, holding my 49-year-old father's hand while he lay on his deathbed. I remember how his breathing was rapid and shallow. I remember how it became ever more shallow and ever more spaced out. Each breath was a struggle for life until finally there were no more breaths. Cancer had claimed its prize. Fast forward 20 years to October 3rd, 2022, and you'll find me holding my mother's hand as her life comes to an end. I remember the sadness in her eyes, despite her giving me more than a son could ever ask for. I remember trying to support her by putting on a brave face, knowing that at last her suffering would come to an end. I remember the shame of failing her when a visible twinge of terror shot through me like a lightning bolt as she began to close her eyes for the last time. Cancer had claimed its next prize. When my father died, it was a heartbreaking situation, but it brought my mother and I closer together in a very deep and very special way. We were facing uncertain times ahead, but I never once felt any fear for the future because I knew that together we would make it through whatever may come. Now that I am alone, I am afraid. As my choices dwindle down to maid or subsisting in indignity, I am truly terrified that I will choose to end my life. A lot transpired in the 2 years between my mother's diagnosis and her passing. It all began in October 2020 when mom's health had deteriorated to the point that we had to go to the ER. After a few days of 8 hours or more in the ER, we were told she had a tumor in the brain and lung. Immediate surgery was required for the brain tumor, and the LIN urged me to enter long-term care temporarily. When I refused, the LIN agreed to provide me with 24/7 home care temporarily via crisis hours, as long as I agreed that the caregivers would not do any meal preparation. The morning before mom's surgery, the LIN called that none of their providers can take on my care and that mom should reschedule her surgery. I was shocked and appalled at this callous treatment. After voicing my concerns, the LIN agreed to a tripartite agreement, and I was left by myself to find a willing service provider with only half a day's notice. As my mother's cancer progressed, we asked many different sources for help, and invariably, we were referred back to the LIN. The LIN continued to tout long-term care as the best option, but suggested that if I am adamant at remaining in my home, then direct funding would be the best choice. For lack of better options, I joined direct funding despite knowing that it was only a partial solution, since the amount of hours that I would get would not be nearly enough for me to survive without a family caregiver. In August 2022, mom's cancer had spread to the pancreas and liver, requiring multiple admissions to the hospital. During this time, LIN staff pressured my mother to convince me to get admitted into long-term care. Mom refused and pleaded with hospital staff to release her so that she could try to help me at home, even though she needed help to take care of herself. While mom was hospitalized, I shed many tears writing a GoFundMe campaign to raise enough money to hire personal support workers and attendants privately. It was a degrading experience to publicly beg for money, but it was the only way I could think of to try to bring mom some peace of mind at the end of her life. During a September 2022 meeting with LIN staff, my mother and I were in tears asking for help to care for me, but again, we were told long-term care. The LIN staff went so far as to say that I needed to finally accept that my life must change. The change they were asking me to accept amounted to a complete loss of identity, employment, and community. The change they were asking me to accept would have been a grave dishonor to the sacrifices my parents made to build me a good life in Canada. Mom and I both adamantly refused to accept this and said we'll take our chances with GoFundMe. For the last several months, I've put in 50 to 60-hour work weeks, 40 hours at my job to support myself, and 15 to 20 hours per week of survival planning. That is, managing existing attendance, recruiting new attendants, lobbying for funding, and various advocacy work. Can you imagine how grueling this is for a person with a neuromuscular disease? The first thing on my mind when I wake up is, how am I going to survive? And it is also the last thing on my mind when I go to sleep. I am no longer capable of relaxing, as the mere thought of engaging in a recreational activity fills me with anxiety and guilt that I should instead be doing more to survive. Physically and mentally, I am exhausted and on the brink of giving up. I am dismayed at the harm brought upon me and my mother by a system that could have chosen to help, but instead chose inaction and adherence to the status quo. My mother deserved to have the space to be sick instead of worrying until her dying breath about what would become of me once she's gone. I deserve to have time to grieve the loss of my mother without feeling guilty and overwhelmed that survival planning must take priority. Despite all my effort, my future remains dangerously uncertain as hard deadlines loom. At the end of March, I will not only lose the essential personal support provided by my uncle, who is visiting from Poland, but also the help of my most experienced attendant, who is moving out of the province. Even one of these conditions alone would be enough to call this a crisis situation. My situation is dire, and I find myself facing a healthcare system that is immensely complex and uncoordinated, with complicated and conflicting rules that result in organizational silos and artificially induced limitations. It is a system where the expectation is that rather than asking for more care hours, a person should instead install a catheter, use laxatives, and sit in a diaper. This makes me feel that my life is not valued, that my life is worthless compared to balance sheets and regulations. Let me ask you, if it was your son or daughter, at what dollar figure would you price their life? Would you be okay with letting him or her sit catheterized in soiled diapers if you knew that it was completely avoidable? I want to continue living a dignified, meaningful life in the community, and the Ministry of Health can make that possible by taking a strong leadership role in cutting red tape and coordinating disparate agencies and services. I implore the Ministry of Health to work with me to find a solution so that they are not implicit in a needless, avoidable, and premature death. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Michael. I think that so many people need to hear this story and recognize the various forms of harm that are happening and the ways in which you can be supported and given access to community. Michael is a software engineer, a homeowner, and someone who has many of the supports that so many disabled people don't have access to. And yet you're still battling so many of the systems that are refusing to see you as a human being and that are refusing to make changes to, yes, a very complicated and difficult to navigate system, but there's ways to engage with creativity, with compassion, and with willingness to try new things in order to provide the support you need to survive. So I have a question coming in for you, which says, "Hi, Michael, can we help you advocate in any way?"
Yes, of course. I mean, raising awareness is a key step in the advocacy process. So reaching out to representatives in the organizations involved in providing some of these services, even reaching out to local MPPs, for example, putting pressure on the people and the decision makers that are able to work with us to help find a solution.
And so what are you demanding for, and what is necessary to ensure that your next few months are that you're able to get the support you need in the next few months?
What I'm looking for is to get the appropriate supports in place to allow me to live in the community, to remain in my home. Effectively, that amounts to additional care hours to be able to function in the home. And that includes for things, for care that isn't always scheduled ahead of time. That seems to be the biggest stumbling block, in the sense that the system is built around a mechanism where the expectation is that one's life is fully regimented and care can be delivered in small chunks of time, whether that means just being able to get out of bed or getting into bed. Whereas the complex care needs that I find as a person with a significant disability require consistent and responsiveness care. So things that come up, whether that's with toileting or emergencies or that sort of thing. So being able to get funding to be able to cover that kind of care is one important aspect. And then going forward, the other facet of the problem is recruiting the staff, the attendants, to be able to provide that care. I think a big step in the right direction is to get the funding piece resolved. And that'll really open up more avenues and possibilities for focusing hard on the recruitment challenges that follow.
So I'm going to share a couple more questions that have come in. Will you be pursuing legal action in the form of advocacy? And I'm wondering if you can, I feel like it would be helpful to explain the steps that you've taken so far, and the tight timelines that you have, and why some forms of things such as legal action are limited because of the timelines.
Yeah, so my timeline is effectively end of March. That's when my existing temporary solution falls apart. So at that point, that's when my care falls off a cliff. When we get to that point, if nothing changes, then effectively I may have enough hours to basically get out of bed and get into bed, but no help throughout the majority of the day. So that means significant problems around things like toileting support, around meals, lunch, dinner, that sort of thing. And it's just not going to be a good situation. Legal challenges take time. There are really no guarantees in terms of winning. Typically, other folks that have gone down this route end up taking, 9-10 years of legal challenges. So with end of March looming ahead, it's not really a feasible approach in order to solve my immediate problem and then get me through to a stable kind of long-term situation.
That's so helpful to get that timeline. And so I have another question. What is the position of Minister Jones what is the position of the minister, in this case, Jones, of Health on your situation? Is she aware of your situation?
And MPP Catherine Fife actually did raise my specific situation in Parliament, and that was addressed to Minister Jones. I would be very happy to speak with the minister to discuss the situation and how she'd be able to help.
And another question, this person said, having worked for the LIN, I'm curious to know what their response was when you asked for support.
The response effectively was long-term care. That is effectively the status quo. When there's no way to provide the level of complex care according to their policies and procedures, then the next step up is institutionalization.
It's so horrifying that the primary response has been so consistently that you should move to long-term care. This makes me furious, and for a few different reasons, but recognizing the harms of long-term care is so essential to understanding why you're demanding these supports and why you need the access to community. For people who don't know, typically when you move into long-term care, you're there for about 18 months. Michael has been refusing and beating the odds of living for how many decades at this point? Many?
Yeah, many. I mean, I'm 39. Initially, doctors suggested that I would die prior to the age of 16. So I'm still kicking, and hopefully I'll be around for a while longer.
And so recognizing that Michael is going to live for a long time, in my opinion, well, in my hope, to be honest, moving into long-term care at this time would mean that you would be forced to be there for a really significant amount of time. And the conditions within long-term care are such that they really expedite the illnesses, harms, and injuries that so much that make life so much more difficult and so much more challenging and so much shorter. And so I think it's important that people understand that it's not just a decision about not wanting to live in long-term care. It's a decision about wanting to live. And in order to live, you need to live in community and you need to be provided the supports you need. And so the next question that we have a few questions from someone about where you're based, and you're based in Ontario. But we have one more question. Is Catherine Fife prepared to follow up on this?
That's a good question. So Catherine Fife is actually not my local MPP, although I have been in contact with my local MPP as well. So definitely on the political front, the players are aware of the situation, and I'm optimistic that they are doing what they can to be able to lobby and help, at least raise awareness and work with decision makers to try to help out with a solution.
Thanks. I'm going to move to the next question. Throughout your whole life, your parents, and since your mother died, your uncle have done so much. How many hours of funded support does the government provide now? And how many hours do government-funded institutions provide?
So right now on the direct funding program, I'm eligible for 41 hours per week of daytime care. In terms of what I would potentially expect in an institution like long-term care, I would say I would be lucky if I get an average of 2 hours per day of direct hands-on care. I believe the sort of goal for the government in the next few years is to increase that up to 4 hours a day of direct care. So even still, I'm much better off remaining at home with my almost 6 hours a day of care that I get on the current program and try to manage that way. The situation will not be good because it's not enough hours, but at least I would be in the comfort of my own home and have more than I would get in an institution where my options would be severely, severely limited.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's horrific that they keep suggesting long-term care when the hours of care support you need are greater right now in your home. And it is such an easy way out for them to say that living in an institution would be the support necessary, when it so clearly will be demonstrated that it won't provide you the support you need, and instead is going to make you less able to do the things that you love and less able to be the person that I know and cherish and care about. And it's so horrific. So thank you for the question. I'm going to move on to another question from anonymous attendee. I am also considering MAID due to lack of home care support. Is there a way that we can band together to remain alive?
I would really hope so. I mean, I don't feel that that MAID is really the appropriate solution here. It's really almost the wrong question to be asking, right? I mean, the question should be, how did we even get to this point where, physically disabled people have to consider this as the only way to maintain some semblance of dignity? I mean, I'd be happy to work with anybody. If there's a way I can help, then by all means reach out to me and we can see what we can do to cooperate.
Yeah, and I would definitely suggest reaching out to DJNO, and we will offer the whatever support we can. So our next question comes from Patricia. What has HCCSS offered? Can you cobble together direct funding plus other government supports?
And this is kind of where we get into the complicated system with unclear rules. It's an avenue that we're hoping to pursue to see if that would be possible, but the rules being so convoluted and at times conflicting with each other without a strong sort of central coordinating authority, it's oftentimes the case where it's simpler for agencies to just over the fence saying, we can do X, Y, and Z. We don't know what this other agency can do. That other agency can do A, B, and C, but not X, Y, Z. Well, who can coordinate between those two? So some level of high-level coordination would be required to get answers to those kinds of aspects. And really that, I think, is where the Ministry of Health can really take on a critical role.
Thanks so much for that question. We have another question. Is this session being recorded and can it be shared? Yes, this session is being recorded and will be shared, available afterwards. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and we'll have links to it on all forms of social media and our website. Gonna move to the next question. You mentioned difficulties with recruitment of care workers. How competitive are the pay rates offered under direct funding? Is that part of the problem? And how do direct funding rates compare with the wage levels in long-term care?
Yeah, it is part of the problem. So recently with the temporary pandemic pay increase becoming a permanent thing from the government, those pay rates did go up slightly. But in a recent assessment that I did of just my local area in Ontario, it's still noticeably behind compared to other home care agencies and as well as other institutions like nursing homes, retirement homes, that sort of thing. And it's not just necessarily a question of hourly compensation or salary, but moreover around total compensation. Typically, if one works for an agency, particularly a bigger agency or a bigger institution, then that opens up possibilities, at least for full-timers, to potentially have access to things like benefits plans, health plans, retirement plans, that sort of thing. Whereas in the case of something like direct funding, then really the only form of compensation is that hourly rate, and that has to account, make up in some way for the difference for all those things that you would be missing. So it is definitely a highly competitive market, and I think that's really even driving up the sort of expectations around hourly wages even more.
Thanks so much for that. So I'm going to move on to the question, have you investigated a live-in caregiver and have you connected with Arch?
Yes, to both of those. So I am still looking into the possibility of a live-in caregiver. So it's something that I have been doing in the past. Unfortunately, it's not very simple to find the appropriate person. It's much more complicated than just doing a sort of tenant landlord agreement, right? The person definitely has to be able to make more of a commitment if they're going to also be a care provider. So that option is definitely on the table. I'm not discounting it, but it is not something that I can see a clear path from A to B to find somebody, particularly in the next few weeks that I've got left. And in terms of Arch, yes, I have been in touch with them to investigate the sort of potential legal avenues that might exist, and that's basically what I mentioned around timelines, not really making that a feasible path forward.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. We have another question. Why is it important for you to have consistent caregivers that can respond to all of your needs?
It's a critical piece to quality of life. So having been on agency care for many, many years, I know how difficult and challenging it is when there is a revolving door of caregivers, especially once we were heading closer towards the pandemic. It even got to the point where orientation or training was not even an option. So the expectation was, we will send a random attendant to you. They are a person, they're capable of moving around, they're physically able, and then it's up to you to figure out how to make your limited time work together. So it's hard to be able to explain one's routines, for example, over and over again constantly. There's also real potential for harm, right? If the person comes in, they're new, it's a constant revolving door. There might be accidents happening around transfers or repositioning not being done properly. It's not the kind of job where you can just easily train somebody, say, at a factory to make a widget on an assembly line. Everyone is different and they have individual needs. So we're not just kind of cogs in the wheel where a person is interchangeable. It takes time to build up that rapport with the person. And it takes time to effectively open up, because you're really letting in that person into very intimate aspects of your life.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the questions. And I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and then we'll conclude this session. So the first is for people who are leaving this session today, what do you hope that they know, and what do you hope that they can do moving forward?
I'd like people to know that I want to find a solution to be able to continue living in the community. I want people to know that I'm desperately trying to avoid MAID as a final solution for lack of better options. And I'd like to ask the people to help spread the word. Reach out to your local officials, reach out to the authorities, let them know that there are more eyes on this situation, that people are supporting my right to live in the community.
Thank you so much. And just to say that we are so grateful to know you, Michael, and thank you for sharing your story with us today. It's so difficult to share the personal details of your life with strangers. And I know, because of how private and introverted you are, that this is not something you do lightheartedly. This is an act of urgency and a demand for safety and support to continue living, to continue being a generous and caring community member that you are. And so I ask that people recognize the importance of this story, recognize the humanity of Michael, and that we continue to move forward in a spirit of justice and grant you what you need to survive, because that's all you're asking for, is literally the basic needs to survive. So we'll be sending out a press release later that everyone can stay tuned for. I see one more question. Oops, popped in the thing.